a little taxonomy.
Yeah, I forgot to turn the recording on, so I'll just turn it on now. Sorry about that, everybody.
So I'll introduce this taxonomy of causes or causal narratives about obesity or fatness. Genetics, this calories in, calories out, or energy balance model, causes and post-genomics, and then obesogenic environments. I'll say a bit more about that and how that's been conceptualized and how that relates to concerns about food justice. And then sort of conclude by suggesting ways in which we could rethink some of this to take into account the effects of weight stigma. So just to start with a little bit of scene setting in terms of the scientific discourses around obesity, which many of you might be familiar with. Deborah Lupton, amongst others, dates the rise of fatness as the subject of intense scientific and public interest to the 1990s. It's in that decade and then the subsequent one that we see this intense focus on the supposed negative health effects and negative economic effects of obesity. I have a picture here of Time magazine cover from 2004, when Time magazine designated 2004 the year of obesity. Sandra Gilman has described the first reference to the obesity epidemic as coming from 1987. We first see it show up with a physician describing childhood obesity as epidemic in the United States. So then in the 90s, we see the term obesity epidemic gaining popularity. You can see some of the papers published in medical journals that begin terming it an epidemic. And framing obesity as an epidemic usually comes along with, always justified by claims that there are far more people who fall into the overweight or obese category defined by body mass index now compared with past eras, particularly in the global north, and also that obesity is associated with a greater instance of a disease and death. And during that time period, it's also closely coupled with concerns about the burden that is being placed and will be placed on healthcare systems. This is also often framed as an economic problem. And so for putative health reasons and economic reasons, obesity becomes a really central topic of research in many fields, particularly public health, but also in biomedicine and in the biosciences. And then with the COVID-19 pandemic, that this sort of intensity of attention was renewed. Obesity has been described as a syndemic. So the COVID and obesity are the sort of syndemic, these twin pandemics that are going to have huge effects on the health of populations. So to summarize the sort of dominant mainstream understanding, obesity forms the central target of concern for scientists, public health experts, policymakers, clinicians, individuals. And these are the typical core components of these mainstream or dominant understandings. Obesity is an epidemic. So the number of individuals globally classified as obese is rising. Obesity is inherently dysfunctional, unhealthy, or diseased, sometimes thought of as a disease in itself. And as such, it constitutes a public health crisis that requires the attention of policymakers, scientists, public health researchers, and the public at large. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes this comes along with ideas that obesity is within an individual's control to significant extent. Narratives. I should say that there appears to be a growing recognition of what gets termed weight stigma amongst people in public health and medicine and various fields that make up obesity science. People are becoming aware of the dangers of stigmatization and blame. However, typically within these dominant discourses, typically these researchers don't challenge the core components. So obesity is still constructed as inherently dysfunctional and something that needs to be tackled or eradicated. And I'll come back to this later. But for now, an important part of the landscape that I want to highlight is the kinds of disruption, critique, and opposition to this dominant understanding that has been offered in recent decades by scholars and activists within disciplines like fat studies, which is kind of an interdisciplinary field, and also within fat politics or fat liberation or fat justice movements. These are just a small selection of books that challenge mainstream understandings of fatness, that challenge, for example, the notion that obesity is an epidemic, that is, that it's increasing at an alarming rate, and that justifies the framing of it as a public health crisis. Sometimes these researchers recast this as a kind of moral panic, challenging the idea that fatness is inherently unhealthy, bringing questions of weight stigma and fat phobia on an interpersonal and structural level to the forefront, and challenging damaging cultural representations of fatness. There's also some very interesting work on the racialization of fatness, or the way that race and fatness intersect, which is also something that I've been thinking about, but I won't talk too much about today. So this is just a kind of broad motivation for my sort of general interest in this, and this broader project that I'm at the beginning of. So obesity is clearly a topic of intense scientific and public interest, with ramifications for public policy and individual behavior. And the science of obesity, both in biomedicine and also in epidemiology and public health, is such an important part of discourses around fatness and weight loss. And you have this, it's this really contentious area where you have people coming at it with completely different frameworks and concerns and ways of understanding body size. However, there's been very little attention paid to this so far by philosophers or philosophers of science. Certainly within other disciplines, there's been a lot of work, but in philosophy of science, there's a pretty notable neglect, despite what I think of as the plethora of interesting philosophical questions. So these are just a few of the questions I'm interested in, some of which I'll touch on today. So I'm interested in our concepts, a concept of obesity or fatness, and whether potentially a conceptual engineering approach could be helpful here. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. I'm interested in values in obesity science, so how weight stigma or fat phobia might influence research, potentially drawing on some of the insights from the values in science literature and feminist philosophy of science, who, you know, have developed ways of tracing social values, like potentially, you know, sexist values or something in the practice, in scientific practice. Questions of causation and explanation. Race, as I mentioned, the public uptake of obesity science, and also recent moves to characterize the obesogenic environment and grapple with weight stigma, and what these shifts do or do not do for our understanding of obesity or fatness, or for fat justice or liberation. It's also something that I will be talking about today. So maybe I should have put this slide at the start, but before I really get into it, I just wanted to acknowledge some of the critical discourses around the term obesity itself. So fat activists and fat studies researchers have criticized the term obesity as having pathologizing connotations and medicalizing fatness. Similarly, terms like underweight, normal weight, and overweight are clearly normatively loaded. There's the implication that there's a normal weight that everybody should aspire to. And so, given these critiques, people in these fields and involved in these political struggles have embraced the word fat. Here I have a quote from Marilyn Wan. There's nothing negative or rude in the word fat unless someone makes the effort to put it there. Using the word fat as a descriptor, not a discriminator, can help dispel prejudice. So it's kind of this reclamation of the term fat. And this is just to explain that I'll be using the term obesity when that's the term that scientists or other scholars are, when that's the term they're using, and when I'm referring to that work, but otherwise I'll use fat, taking this into consideration. Okay, so what would it mean to reconceptualize fatness. So the basic argument is this, that fat phobia or discrimination against fat people on both a structural and an interpersonal level is a pervasive feature of society. This means that fat people have systematically different life experiences to thin people. And then, given this, perhaps we shouldn't see fatness as a given biological category, but as a social category that represents a positioning of certain kinds of bodies within a social hierarchy. Okay, so just to motivate these claims a little bit, here's an example of some of the kinds of empirical evidence for pervasive fat phobia. So, for example, fat children are more likely to experience social isolation and bullying. Weight stigma is associated with mental health harms. There's also evidence for medical fat phobia. So doctors tend to spend less time in appointments with fat patients compared with thinner patients. Patients who report having experienced weight bias in the healthcare setting have poor treatment outcomes and are likely to avoid future care. And then we have data on economic inequality. So fat people receive lower starting salaries, can be ranked as less qualified, and can work longer hours than do thinner employees. Sorry, I did something with my computer and lost looking at my slides. Apologies, give me 1 second. Okay. Okay. Come back. Yeah, so and this is when we control for the other factors that at play. Obviously, there are questions about direction of causation, but there are attempts to determine causation in these studies for sure. So fat people can also be perceived to be less suitable for employment and are less likely to be invited for an interview, or if employed, are perceived to be less successful. Interestingly, there's an interaction with gender. So these effects start showing up in the data at a lower BMI for women than for men. And studies in the UK and the US show at least a correlation between fatness and lower socioeconomic status. So I should say that this evidence is largely coming from the UK and the US. I am not I'm not intimately familiar with the evidence from Europe, but my intuition is that I'd see similar patterns. And here's just an example of some qualitative evidence. There's a lot of qualitative evidence, and I've just picked one study from Australia, just to give a small flavor of the kinds of ways in which weight stigma plays out. So here we have some very difficult quotes from these interviews. I had a miscarriage and I told someone, and they said to me just in the middle of the street, "Oh, well, it's probably all for the best." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, you wouldn't want to have a child when you're that weight." I was just devastated. The manager at my job told me that I had to lose weight because it was affecting my work. I work on the web, making websites available to people with disabilities. My weight is completely irrelevant. I was so stunned that she thought she could call me on that. And then particularly sad one, my family keep talking about me being fat, and it's just totally depressing. I go home, I feel sad, I feel lonely. And I mean, there are many other stories, but the qualitative evidence suggests that weight stigma can affect somebody in sort of all aspects of their life, so their family life, their work life, and so on. There was a case in the UK not so long ago of a couple that had their child taken away from them from social services because the child was fat. So there's evidence to suggest that weight stigma is the kind of thing that affects somebody in a kind of holistic way across their life. So it's for these kind of reasons that it has been argued that fat oppression exists. So this paper from 2014 that takes Sally Haslanger's definition of oppression, where oppression occurs when unjust systematic harms are suffered by the members of some group as members of that group, and oppression can be grounded in institutions or individuals. And Ella suggests that the discrimination faced by fat people is systematic because its presence in one aspect of their lives can extend its influence to another distinct aspect of their lives. Fat prejudice begins early in life and continues throughout it. Earlier harms beget and compound later ones. Moreover, the harms suffered by fat people extend to every aspect. And she says that fat people find themselves in a double bind where people in the double bind can't act in the right kind of way. So if fat people don't try to lose weight, then they'll suffer ridicule and discrimination. They do try to lose weight. That is very, very difficult. So the often cited statistic is that 95% of people who lose weight go on to regain it within 5 years. And so you end up either you don't try to lose weight and you suffer ridicule and discrimination, or you try to lose weight and fail, and then you have reduced self-esteem, you have feelings of failure and self-loathing. And we think of the double bind as a kind of something that's characteristic of oppression in other cases as well. So in the case of race, or in the case of gender, say a case of, women being maybe taken less seriously, if you sort of act in maybe a feminine kind of way, but if you act in a less feminine kind of way, you're also seen as somehow, defying gender norms, and you also face social punishment. So Ella's suggesting that this is a reason to think that fat people are sort of similar kind of category that can face oppression. And she reiterates, so oppression harms members of the group of fat people as members of their group. So there's this causal connection between having a fat body and, for example, making less money. And that causal link is non-accidental. And I'll come back to this causal story a bit later. So for these kind of reasons, I think this is an opportunity to rethink our concept of fat from a biological to a social category. I won't go too much into the details, but if anybody is familiar with Sally Haslanger's ameliorative project with respect to race or gender, so this idea that instead of thinking about race as referring to some kind of real biological population, the better way to think about race is about positioning on a social hierarchy where certain physical characteristics mark you out for that positioning. In this case, the suggestion here is that rather than just seeing it as, for example, let's say a disease would be one way of construing it under the medical model would be to see something like obesity as a disease, large body size as a disease, to think about it primarily as a kind of positioning on a social hierarchy that can come along with all kinds of health effects. And I'll talk a bit more as well about the entanglement between the biological and the social. And just before I go on, I just want to say something really brief about fatness and health, because I think that the immediate reaction is often to say, well, clearly obesity is unhealthy, right? Clearly it's dysfunctional, clearly it leads to poor health outcomes. So why, can't we think that and also think, okay, well, we shouldn't be, mean to people, but still, this is a disease, this is at risk of disease. I don't think this is central to the argument, but I just want to highlight that actually the sort of evidence about the connection, any kind of any strong claim about the sort of an automatic connection between obesity and disease is not can't be justified by the evidence. This is just an example of a study carried out by the CDC in the United States, a big epidemiological study that compared the risk of mortality across BMI groups, body mass index, so the typical underweight, normal weight, overweight, and obese. And these researchers found that in the US, the lowest mortality risk was in the overweight category, and there were 86,000 excess deaths in the normal category in comparison. You saw essentially the shape of the data was that as you get into the underweight category, you see quite a steep rise in excess deaths. It takes quite a while in terms of going up the BMI numbers to see excess deaths rising. So the risk of premature death associated with obesity was negligible or non-existent until BMI 35. So that's in comparison, the risk associated with underweight was very high. Paul Campos, who is a big critic of the dominant biomedical model, sums this up and says that these authors found that the risk of premature death was higher among women who look like Kate Moss or Gwyneth Paltrow than the combined premature death risk found among average height women at all weight levels above 203 pounds. And he makes the obvious point that if a certain weight level is associated with the lowest risk of premature death, what does it mean to label such people overweight? It seems like something, we think those descriptors are saying something about health outcomes, but they're probably saying something about social values. And interestingly, so Catherine Flegel, who was the lead author on this paper, recently, a couple of years ago, published this personal essay reflecting on her experience with that study and the extreme pushback she received from the scientific community. So I think it's just an interesting example of the way that certain assumptions are very entrenched in science and in public health, and the kind of social, the sort of something else I'm interested in is thinking about this like social character of science and the social dynamics that influence and inform knowledge production in controversial areas in general, but in this case, obesity science. So there are reasons to question the labeling of obesity as a disease in itself, or the assumption that fatness is inherently unhealthy. In my view, the epidemiological evidence is mixed. However, even if there turns out to be a causal connection between fatness and particular health outcomes, can nevertheless be the case that social values play an important role in shaping choices made in scientific inquiries into obesity and shaping public health strategies, and so on. And it can still be the case that who is considered fat is dependent on social context, right? So this is part of the reimagining of fatness is social. So, for example, researchers are uncovering metabolic heterogeneity. So it's not the case that everybody who is a larger body size has metabolic dysfunction. Everybody smaller body size has, good metabolic function. That is actually very, very messy, and there's lots of heterogeneity. And so researchers have coined this term metabolically obese normal weight, to refer to people who are normal weight by BMI, but show metabolic dysfunction that's sort of associated with obesity, or sort of conceptually associated, even though that's not occurring in an obese or fat person. So this is to say, it seems that there are some biological properties, right? There is variation. There are biological properties like metabolic dysfunction that are useful in thinking about the connection with health outcomes, but it doesn't really map on neatly to body size. And then sort of in contrast, we have fatness as potentially as a social property, which is connected to body size, but it's not as simple as that. So it depends on the social context, whether somebody will be considered fat or not, whether they'll be positioned on that hierarchy, if the hierarchy exists. It can depend on where the fat is deposited. Some, shapes are socially acceptable, and some less so. So I think the analogy with race is sort of partially fruitful, where there are actual sort of physical characteristics, right? There are various features that are sort of physical or biological properties, but they don't map very neatly onto what we would understand as race. But the way that we interpret those can mark somebody out for positioning on a social hierarchy. I think you could think about fatness as something similar. And then that positioning on the hierarchy itself can end up having biological and health effects. So to move on and talk a little bit about mapping the causes and how causal narratives come along with broader ethical and political narratives. So this is a quote from Sandra Gilman, who says, "What fascinates me is the power of using the term epidemic in the context of obesity as a means of characterizing obesity as a disease. Obesity is not itself a disease, but rather a phenomenological category which reflects the visible manifestation of body size, which in turn can have multiple and multifactorial causes. No one dies from obesity. One dies from those pathologies which may result from extreme overweight. Obesity may be a tertiary cause of morbidity or mortality. It may lead to diabetes, which may lead to vascular disease. Thus, the image of an epidemic of obesity demands a single, clearly defined cause for this disease, much as we have encountered in other recent epidemics of infectious diseases. It's striking that the assumptions about the monocausality of obesity, the latter's representation as having a single cause, is part of the urban myth of disease." So Gilman is trying to suggest that by terming it an epidemic, we're sort of implying that there's this single cause. And Gilman has this kind of historical analysis where he identifies 7 proposed causes over time that have had various uptake in different eras. So for him, he's just a shift in the quality of life and life expectancy, psychological makeup, where obesity is seen as mental illness, abundant access to poor quality food and restricted access to opportunities for exercise, loss of control over food through addictive behavior, a genetic predisposition to accumulate body fat arising from our evolutionary history, disruption of normal growth caused by endocrine system changes and as a result of infection. So for Gilman, these are kind of things that have been picked up and sort of had greater and lesser uptake over time, and he outlines the sort of historical connections to race and to anti-Semitism and ideas about the Jewish body. But in my case, so I have 4 broad classes of causes looking sort of more at the sort of contemporary landscape, whereas what Gilman is trying to do, I think, is pick out very specific causes. These 4 categories are kind of fluffy. They're more something like causal narratives or frameworks or ways of approaching this question of obesity, and I've sort of grouped them together in a little bit of an ad hoc way, because the categories themselves contain a fairly heterogeneous set of actual causes, but they come along, they are narratives that come along with certain ideas about responsibility and intervention. So I'll talk about 3 of them quite briefly, and then I'll hopefully have time to talk a bit more about obesogenic environments. So genetic causes, the search for genetic causes has been ongoing for decades. Some of these explanations involve these evolutionary hypotheses. So famously, James Neal in 1962 proposed this thrifty gene hypothesis to explain the prevalence of diabetes, then was later expanded to explain obesity, where the diabetic genotype is a thrifty genotype that's really efficient in the intake or utilization of food. And so the evolutionary story is that past humans lived as hunter-gatherers whose lifestyles involved these cycles of feast or famine, and so would have benefited from a genotype that can hold on to energy when they get it. And still, even though the thrifty gene hypothesis has been called into question, there's still this sort of ongoing program debate over potentially evolutionary explanations for obesity. But aside from the evolutionary accounts, we also have genetics researchers that worked to uncover particular genes or combinations of genes that could be causally responsible. So there were some breakthroughs in the 90s in terms of single gene mutation. So this gene, mutation in the LEP gene that results in extremely low levels of leptin, which is a hormone that's involved in the regulation of energy homeostasis, metabolism. And so there were these sort of initial wins of finding these single gene causes. However, these turn out to be sort of implicated in a very small percentage of the population. And then the advent of these genome-wide association studies allow researchers to look to search the whole genome for these genetic loci that are associated with obesity and put together these polygenic risk scores. The idea is that you have lots of genes that might be contributing a very, very small amount. So there have been sort of mixed results so far, but there is work developing polygenic risk scores for susceptibility to obesity, summing these small effects of many loci across the genome. The idea is hopefully that could generate predictions, which maybe could be put to use in a clinical setting. What I find a bit interesting about this is that despite an ongoing research program into the genetic causes of obesity, there has been relatively little uptake in terms of public health messaging or just sort of broader public discourse. I think not to rely on this analogy with race too much, but in contrast, so in other areas in which you've got the science that's interacting with these socially salient categories, you have this kind of slip, so genetic differences into group, genetic research into group differences can lead to sometimes, pernicious genetic determinist thinking. People seem quite keen to sort of leap on suggestions of genetic difference, in the case of race, to sort of bolster kind of racial essentialism. But in the case of obesity, there's been pretty limited purchase. This is an example from just the NHS website under causes of obesity. Some people claim there's no point trying to lose weight because it runs in my family or it's in my genes. While there's some rare genetic conditions that can cause obesity, such as Prader-Willi syndrome, there's no reason why most people cannot lose weight. You see similar kind of language on the US CDC website as well. So while I won't go into it here, I think a likely contributing factor is the landscapes of responsibility and intervention that genetic determinist narratives open up or close off. So in this case, the attribution of larger body size to genetic causes is in tension with the attribution of personal responsibility to individuals, and personal responsibility is such a key component of the stigmatizing attitudes towards fat people and the maintenance of anti-fat discrimination. So the second one that I'll talk about is this calories in, calories out model, where the body is like a machine and one's body size depends on calculation of calorie intake and calorie expenditure. This is a really popular way of thinking about fatness or obesity. I think I should go a little bit quicker, but essentially this is very popular. I mean, we have these calorie counting apps, we have calorie labeling on food. Just last year, new calorie labeling regulations were implemented in England, requiring businesses over a certain size to provide calorie information on their menus. And the model seems to persist despite scientific challenges to the simplistic notion of the body as a motor. But this model is easily drawn on to place blame on individuals for their perceived failure to control their calorie intake or expenditure. It might contribute to stigma. And we also have, before I go on to talk about obesogenic environments, which kind of widens the scope outside of the body, there's also a sort of mix of causes that we find in post-genomic science, which by that I just mean the life sciences after the sequencing of the human genome, and sort of technological and conceptual developments that have happened, and move away from gene centrism and gene reductionism, looking at fields such as epigenetics, the way in which the environment might influence gene expression, microbiome science, the microbes that live, in our skin, mouth, vagina, particularly in the case of obesity, the gut, and developmental origins of health and disease framework, which looks at particularly in utero influences that might have later life effects across the life course. These kind of conceptual shifts, this blurring of the biological and the social, I think has the potential to provide this link between a sort of biologically based model and something which takes into account the social environment, although I don't know if we fully see that coming to fruition at the moment. Okay, so finally, obesogenic environments. This is a contrasting approach which supposedly moves away from a narrow focus on calorie intake and calorie output to a wider appreciation of the role of the environment. So this is this research program was kind of started by this paper in 1999, which defined the obesogenicity of the environment as the sum of influences that the surroundings, opportunities, or conditions of life have on promoting obesity in individuals or populations. They provided a framework for conceptualizing the obesogenic environment and identifying key points of intervention, so dissecting the environment along two dimensions: size, macro and micro, and type, physical, economic, political, and socio-cultural. Since the development of this, there's been a boom in studies that aim to investigate, characterize, and intervene on the obesogenic environment. So it's been suggested that this turn towards environmental determinants is sort of less normatively loaded. So it could shift the focus from the putative moral failings of fat people to the structural environmental causes of obesity. In sum, the obesogenic environment thesis is that the increased prevalence of obesity is because people are surrounded by cheap, fast, nutritionally inferior food, as well as a built environment that discourages physical activity. And this is where calls for food justice intersect. So think of food deserts, lack of access to fresh fruits and vegetables, either because of distance, because of cost. So trying to think, still maintaining this energy balance model, this calories in, calories out, but looking sort of beyond just individual choices, widening it out to features of the environment that might influence either side. But there has been criticism of the standard way of thinking about it. So Coles and Evans argue that this continues to position fat bodies as problematic and in need of intervention. Obesogenic environment research starts with the assumption that fat body is inherently unhealthy and conceptualizes the relationship between bodies and environment still in terms of the calories in, calories out model, where the obesogenic environment disrupts the natural energy balance of the body by increasing calorie intake or decreasing calorie expenditure. Jenny Guzman has also been critical of the sort of standard obesogenic environment model that still assumes calories in, calories out, in a way that might foreclose alternative explanations, including the possible role of environmental toxins. So in terms of disrupting hormone regulation or other metabolic processes, and thereby contributing to larger body size. And so for Guzman, she argues that we need to think about the political economy more broadly. She says we have a political economy that produces and makes available cheap foods and goods, underpays people, and then urges them to buy this food and these goods to keep the economy afloat. Then a culture that blames them for consuming this food and these goods. After all, a large part of this political economy involves barely regulated food, chemical, and pharmaceutical industries that produce materials, not all of which are willingly ingested, inhaled, or absorbed, but which modify our bodies in ways we barely understand. So for Guzman, she thinks that the rise in obesity warrants explanation, but we need to be careful about the harms. We need to rethink an emphasis on size and risk factors. And we also need to think about non-caloric pathways to obesity, environmental toxins, and pharmaceuticals. We need to think more broadly about the role of socioeconomic status, about geopolitical and political economic interests that have encouraged overproduction, failed to regulate food production, and recognize that eating behaviors are mediated by a more complex set of social factors than just education and access, that are move away from this public health strategy that individualizes, in the UK with 5 a day or something, that tries to intervene on the level of the individual and shift our focus towards structural factors. And so earlier on, I introduced this reconceptualization of fatness, and I want to bring it together with all this thinking about causation and what kind of causes are being built into models, being investigated and mapped, and how this affects what we get out. So so this is just roughly this kind of how the obesogenic environment stuff is thought about within the medical model or the energy balance model. So you have an obesogenic environment where there's maybe high availability of nutritionally poor food and low availability of nutritionally good food, and there's also a lack of access to opportunities for exercise. This leads to increased calorie intake and decreased calorie expenditure. That leads to increased body size, and that leads to poor health outcomes. That's the basic model. But what gets left out of that story? So as Guzman highlighted, broader factors in the environment like toxins that might disrupt metabolism, broader social factors like shift work. So Hannah Landecker has done some work on the way in which night shifts and this disruption of circadian rhythms might affect metabolism. And then what I'm particularly interested in is the causal effect of fat phobia or weight stigma. So I'm going to just illustrate this very quickly by sort of turning to the microbiome. So in our gut, we have this microbiome that's filled with bacteria, archaea, viruses, that is a really important necessary part of digestion that's in this relationship with our metabolic processes, and there's been increasing attention to how important that is. So from the mid-2000s onwards, studies in mice models and humans found differences in microbiome composition between lean and obese individuals. In general, this research program is trying to build a picture of the microbiome as a causal agent that can dispose individuals to obesity or to leanness. So just as in the obesogenic environment literature, you have this environment that's kind of the causal driver. In this research, trying to say the microbiome, a particular kind of microbiome composition could drive obesity or leanness. thinking about it as this causally efficacious organ that then opens up the possibility of interventions that would prevent or cure obesity. So this is just a little diagram of the kinds of causal pathways that are being mapped in this research. So microbiome scientists obviously acknowledge other factors in driving body size. So typically the ones they acknowledge will be diet and genetics. We could build in a bigger picture here. So we could include an obesogenic environment that then mediates diet that leads to body size difference. And they also acknowledge interactions. So obviously what we eat affects our gut microbiome. What we're feeding the microbiome affects, what bacteria live and which don't. And our genetics do as well. So this is a fairly complex causal map that researchers are building. However, there's one arrow that's almost entirely neglected, and this is this one going from body size to the microbiome. I'll explain what I mean. I think this is a neglected causal pathway where the experience of being fat could itself affect microbiome composition. So as I've suggested, we have this evidence to suggest that weight stigma or fat phobia is widespread. This leads to fat people having systematically different life experiences. And the microbiome is not only influenced by host genetics, but also by a range of environmental factors. And this opens up the possibility for fatness itself to factor into a causal explanation for microbiome composition. This is not to deny that the other causal pathways aren't going on, but this is one factor that I think is notably neglected. So the reasons for thinking this might be that there might be an impact. So there's some research indicating that stress impacts the microbiome, so through the microbiome brain-gut axis. And there's also been some recent work on racism in the microbiome, suggesting that racial discrimination in all its facets could have effects. So I think that's a way forward to understanding the effects of fatness as a social category and everything that comes along with on the microbiome and health outcomes. And there might be sort of other features of the fat experience too. So this is, I sort of did this diagram at the last minute. I don't know if it's very helpful, but this is just an idea of the kinds of the ways in which rethinking sort of making fat phobia or weight discrimination sort of a central target of analysis could impact how we think about causation. So just as an example, this structural and interpersonal fat phobia can lead to things like, so direct discrimination, for example, could lead to lower income, increased unemployment, could lead to increased stress, a poorer social network, less access to quality healthcare. And so in the case of, say lower income, that could affect, the place where you live. So therefore, something like environmental toxins, it can limit your access to a range of foods, and then those things can impact our physiology, our microbiome, metabolic processes, epigenetic changes, and some of these things can sort of directly lead to poorer health outcomes. So just to sum up, that understanding fatness as a social category enables to attend to and center the phenomenon of fat phobia and weight stigma, and see it as a potential causal agent. So it's different from an approach that sees weight stigma as a causal contributor to body size, and from body size flows for health outcomes. So this is the kind of narrative that is becoming a bit more standard in public health, that we should care about weight stigma because weight stigma actually, causes people to put on weight, and that's the thing we really care about. But rather thinking about the ways in which weight stigma might have these more direct, might have these causal effects that don't go through any sort of inherent effect of body size on health outcomes. So, for example, in the way that weight stigma impacts income and employment, that can keep people in environments that have toxins or that have poor quality food. And that needs to be part of our conversation about food justice and food access. And weight stigma likely has direct physiological or health effects on the microbiome and on epigenetics, and also directly through medical fat phobia and reduced access to quality healthcare. So it's just a sketch of the way in which we're thinking our causal models together with this reconceptualization of fatness could be fruitful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. So we'll have a 5-minute break for folks to get coffee, water, whatever you need, and then we'll come back and have questions. You're welcome to put questions in the chat if you'd like me to read them out, or you can raise your hand and share them out, but we'll start with questions in 5 minutes. So see you all back here in 5.